This is Jeremy with the Next Big Idea Club, and I'm here with Annie Murphy-Paul. She is a science journalist and the author, as you know, of The Extended Mind, The Power of Thinking Outside the Brain. So, Annie, it's great to see you again.
Yeah. Hi, Jeremy. Great to be here again.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I think we had a great chat a couple weeks ago, but
Mhm.
there's just so much interesting stuff going on in your book that I'm really glad we had a chance to do a part two, because I think people are really interested to continue to hear more about this stuff straight from you. But first, before we get into any of that, is there any book news that's been going on with you the last couple weeks? Like, how's the promotion been going for this exciting project of yours?
Oh, wow. Well, I guess the biggest news in my world is just that after months and months of online events like this, virtual events, because, normally when I have a book come out, there's bookstore readings and live events and whatever. And none of that this year following the publication of my book in June. But I now have coming up a bunch of live events, and I'm so excited to
Wow.
see people in person and to talk to an audience and get their reaction and have that social presence, which is a phrase I use in the book. But yeah, I miss that. And so I'm really excited to be able to leave New Haven and leave my house and, go mix and mingle with people again. I think that'll be fun.
That's great. Yeah. Do you consider yourself someone that really enjoys public speaking, or does it make you a little bit nervous?
Oh, it makes me nervous, but
Mm.
I really enjoy talking with people. It's always the question and answer session afterward that I find most interesting. I love to hear what people are thinking about, and often their questions surprise me. So
Mm.
I do my work as a writer is very solitary. So I do like to mix it up with getting out and seeing people now and then.
Right. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I'm not a writer, quite in the sense that you are, but I do some freelance writing on the side.
Mhm.
And yeah, it does feel very solitary at times, just kind of locking yourself in your room and pounding some stuff out. So I can certainly
Mhm.
relate.
Mhm.
So really just even in the last couple of weeks, we had even more members writing in with questions and comments about your work. And so I wanted to get us started here with a question from a member. And by the way, anybody watching this, you know the drill. If you'd like to ask Annie a question, feel free to drop it in the chat here in Zoom. But I wanted to start here with a question from Kelly Reynolds. And she says, considering the research presented in the book, what are the consequences of staying in a 100% work at home environment? There's something we can all relate to. What
Mhm.
strategies can be used in hybrid work environments to achieve the advantages of thinking with our surroundings and with our relationships?
Yeah, that is a great question. And it's so much on people's minds these days as people are trying to figure out what their work lives are going to look like going forward. And a few thoughts come to mind. One is this idea that I talk about in the book called intermittent collaboration. And the idea there is that it's not ideal to be, as we were just saying, alone all the time with your own ideas. We really need the cross fertilization of other people's ideas and the kind of mental processes that get activated by social interaction that just don't happen when you're by yourself. But we also need time alone, and
Hmm.
not just to protect ourselves from distraction, although that's huge also. And anyone who's worked in an open office knows how difficult it can be to get complex cognitive work done in that kind of distracting environment. We also need to isolate ourselves at times when we work, because we are such social creatures and we're so susceptible to social pressure that this really interesting research that I'm talking about on intermittent collaboration finds that people who are in contact with their coworkers all the time, they tend to come up with they tend to circle around and achieve consensus on a bunch of ideas that are sort of mediocre, like not great,
Hmm.
not terrible, but everybody can kind of agree that yeah, that's fine. And
Right.
that's what happens when you're in too much touch and contact with your coworkers. On the other hand, people who are isolated and doing their thinking on their own, they tend to have a few really great ideas because they are thinking in this original and sort of independent way, but then a bunch of ideas that are not good at all because they're not sort of field testing them against, the perceptions of others. So the way to get the best of both worlds is to have this oscillation between working alone, being together. And I'm wondering if, as we contemplate, going back to work in some form, going back to the office in some form, whether a hybrid environment couldn't support intermittent collaboration in a productive way. Could your time at home function as your time when you're protected from those social influences and from those distractions? And then time in the office, could that be structured intentionally as the time when we're really collaborating and consulting with each other? Again, we'd have to be really intentional about that. We don't want to just go back to the way it was, where you're kind of putting in your time at the office just for the sake of FaceTime or whatever. It would have to be structured in such a way that it was really supporting that kind of intense social engagement. And by the same token, that time at home would have to really be protected as time for deep thinking and deep work, and you're not having to be on Slack or on email all the time.
Right.
So I don't know. I think that could work. It's also experimental. It's also unknown at this point. And the other piece I was thinking about was the stuff I write about in the book about the literal physical surroundings of your workplace and imbuing that workplace with cues of identity and cues of belonging. And that's obviously something we can do very readily in our own home. And in fact, our homes, often are places where they're the ultimate place of belonging, where we feel comfortable and feel like we can be ourselves. Work has always been more of a challenge there. And I wonder if it's going to be even more so, because I hear about so many offices going to this kind of hoteling or hot desking kind of arrangement where, because not everybody is coming in every day, there's fewer desks available, and there's not a designated space for each employee. Lots of offices are reducing their footprint. And so it's kind of like you grab a desk when you come in. And I wonder if that has some potential downsides, in the sense that it's a generic space. It wasn't yours yesterday and it won't be yours tomorrow, and it's really totally lacking those cues of identity and belonging. So one thought I've had is, can leaders or managers make it possible for employees to see those cues, access those cues, maybe in the office in general, or maybe have lockers so that people can have their stuff and have it with them on the days that they're at work. I worry about people going into a space that's so transient and not full of those rich signifiers that help us think well in a particular space.
Right. No, I think it's so interesting when you frame the issue that way, because I see a tension almost between what we want and what we need, in the sense that we want the flexibility, right, that comes with being able to work from home or just to grab any old desk at the office, right? But when we do that, when we don't have a dedicated space in the office, we don't have those belonging cues as readily, they're not as readily available to us. And we need those in a certain way to do our best work. And so, is there a way that we can reconcile that desire for flexibility, what we want, with the need for some groundedness and some belonging cues? Like, how do we bring those two together?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And as you were talking, I was thinking, I wonder if creating a sense of belonging is going to be an even greater challenge for leaders and managers these days, because people are not going to be coming in every day and they might increasingly feel like strangers, So I think that belonging piece is going to be really front and center. But in terms of balancing, as you were saying, the need for kind of stability and familiarity with the need for flexibility, I think about the part of the book that's about how important it is for people to have control over their own setting, and how that really promotes it really promotes intelligent thought. We think better. We use the space in a sense, when we're able to arrange it ourselves, we use it as an extension of our minds. And so we can offload some of our mental work onto the environment as long as we're the ones who are controlling it. And it also affects us emotionally and psychologically in the sense that when we're on our own turf, we're more confident, we have a higher sense of self-esteem, all these things. So I think, again, as you say, it's a balancing act between structuring very intentionally, as we were saying before, the work environment and giving a lot of thought to that, but then also allowing people the latitude to arrange and design their spaces the way they want to.
Right.
It's not anything we've ever encountered before. We've never had so many people not in the office, and now we're trying to figure out what the next iteration of the office is going to look like.
Yeah, no, I think it's an exciting new chapter that hopefully we're all about to start collectively. So it's great to see that some of our live viewers have written in with questions. For example, Melissa Painter wrote in with 3 questions and also added, in all caps, "I love your book. Thank you." So thank you for watching, Melissa, and for tuning in. So she's got 3 great questions here. The first of which, I know that there's, so far we've been talking about the extended mind in terms of working professionals and, how we can use these insights to, work better and be more creative. But Melissa is also wondering about our kids who are still in school. And so she says, what type of impacts, or what impact are you hoping your ideas will have on youth and little kids? And who so far seems to be getting it right, using some of these insights to make school easier and better for kids.
Oh, I love that question. So hi, Melissa. Thank you so much for your interest in the book and for your questions. I mean, one of the really gratifying things about putting this book out into the world has been the very enthusiastic response from teachers and educators across the spectrum. And I think that's because teachers are people who spend all of their time thinking about how people think and how people learn and how to create congenial environments for that to happen. So a lot of teachers have said to me, like, I do a lot of the things that your book advises. I just didn't know there was research behind it,
Oh,
so
cool. Like what?
That's
what
been really fun. Yeah. And so I have heard lots of examples from teachers about how they incorporate physical movement into their classes, or how they arrange the physical space, or how they facilitate social interactions among kids in ways that promote an extended mind or a group mind among the students. I would say in general that I've always thought that Montessori schools really, Maria Montessori was herself really ahead of her time and really a pioneer in applying all these things that, the research has only come into being in decades since she did her pioneering work, but so much of it supports her own interventions and her own practices. So I'm thinking of things like the way Montessori teachers use a lot of manipulatives. They really do involve the body, and it's not just about sitting still in one place. It's really about moving the body, like tracing. I was a Montessori kid myself, so I can remember like tracing letters, like, on this sort of sandpapery kind of thing. I mean, the body was really a vehicle for teaching, a channel for teaching in Montessori classrooms. And the space, again, was incredibly important to Maria Montessori. And you see that in Montessori classrooms today. There's the idea of like the prepared space that's very carefully thought out in order to create a learning kind of environment. And then finally, Montessori always has this emphasis on social interaction and learning from each other. And so I think it's really remarkable, actually, how prescient Maria Montessori was in understanding, and it may have just been from very close observation of how kids actually learn, and not getting caught up in these ideas we have, which lots of them are very flawed or misinformed about about how kids learn, about how people learn, that that cut out like the body and spaces and other people. So I admire her enormously for kind of setting that standard long before, you know, she was out there way before the scientists, where the scientists are just sort of following in her wake.
Right. Yeah, and what I love about this idea is that I feel like it almost it democratizes the potential for achievement in the sense that so often we think about, you know, kids in school is like, oh well, you've got the gifted kids over here and the other kids over here, you know, and that's just how they are. But what I love about your work and, you know, what we're talking about right now is we're saying that no, if these ideas are taught in a certain way, if the physical space is organized in a certain way, then that can help everybody achieve a lot better and to much higher levels. And this actually intersects beautifully with another question submitted by a member recently. James Toole says, how does the extended mind intersect with the mountain of research being done now on mindsets by Carol Dweck, for example? So yeah, I feel like that feeds into this discussion quite well. Like, what do you think about mindsets and how that intersects with the extended mind?
Yes. Yeah. Well, I'll say first of all that I really admire Carol Dweck, the originator of mindset theory, and I really admire the work she's done and the idea she's introduced to students and teachers about how an idea that I very much agree with, that intelligence is not some kind of fixed quantity, but something that can be developed and grown. And I love that. On the other hand, I do think in some ways that the extended mind poses a challenge to some aspects of growth mindset theory in this particular way, that I think growth mindset can be in the way it's applied very brain centric. I mean, there's a lot of talk within growth mindset instruction about the brain is a muscle, and you know, your brain gets stronger just like a physical muscle by exercising it more and more. And again, although I think that's a really helpful message to many students, it also leaves out so many other resources that a student could be drawing into their thinking that are not about just sort of exercising the brain. And that's what I love about the theory of the extended mind, is that it offers such a wide menu, a rich menu of options. You know, if a kid is struggling with an academic task, it may be that just staying there and exercising their brain is a recipe for frustration and distress, you know, whereas if a kid knows that, oh, I have lots of ways of approaching this, I could take a walk, I could act this out, I could teach my younger sibling or friend if that other kid is willing, or my parent. You know, I could teach them, I could tell a story about it, I could have a debate about it, I could maybe go outside for a while, I could use gesture. You know, there's just so many ways of bringing in outside the brain resources to mix things up, to change the context, to change the mental state that you're in, that I think it's such a fruitful way of approaching thinking in a way that sort of augments the as the reader mentioned, this very well established case for the growth mindset.
Right. And, you know, interestingly, I think what's great is that as you're describing all these advantageous approaches to learning, whether it's having a debate or whatever, as you're speaking, I'm thinking to myself, man, that kind of sounds like fun, you know? It's almost like, you know, these ways of learning that you're describing, not only are they more effective, but they just seem more enjoyable too, right? I mean, it sure beats just kind of sitting at your desk quietly for, you know, 8 hours a day, every day, and taking notes and then going home. I mean, you know, really engaging with your body more, engaging with your surroundings more, and with your peers more. I mean, it sounds like also just a more enjoyable experience for everybody, for teachers and students, right? I mean, is that, you know, I can't imagine that that's a coincidence. I'd imagine that that's connected to the fact that it is a better way to learn too, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, for one thing, it embraces the whole of who we are. It doesn't reduce us to just being a brain. It acknowledges the fact that we are we are in bodies embedded in physical settings and in these social networks. It really expands to include all of who we are. And I think some of that really, that not so fun approach to not just schoolwork, but also we bring that into our adult lives as workers. Like, I just have to sit here and keep hammering away until I get this done. It actually, not only is it really unpleasant and sort of punitive, but it's also often not the best way to get your work done. And so I think there's the aspect of sort of freedom and autonomy and choice that, like, oh, I have options here. I have choices, and that's something that people always appreciate. But also, as you say, just being in touch with the fact that we're not just brains, we're not just minds. We have this whole other range of capabilities that so often get left out in our schools and our workplaces.
Yeah, very well said. Totally agree. So, moving on to another this is another one that Melissa asks. She says, what do you think about the impact of navigation apps on our brain and our memory? And as a quick aside here, I am very interested in this because I have, ever since moving back home to Florida, once COVID hit, I've been driving to see this friend of mine about an hour away for like the last 6 months or so. And I've gone like pretty much every week. And I still don't think I could get there without Google Maps. And like, it was just recently that I was like, man, I really feel like I should know this by now, but I still don't, because I'm just asking the app to do it for me. So you tell me, should I be cutting back on my Google Maps usage or?
Well, yeah, because, we've been talking here about extending the mind with the body's physical space and other people. But originally the theory of the extended mind was really focused on how we extend our minds with our tools, including our technological devices. And I didn't get to write about that quite as much in the book as I would like to, but I'm very interested in not only the ways in which we extend our minds with our devices. And I think we all know that we can do that. Like our iPhones carry out a lot of our mental functions these days, like remembering phone numbers and things like that. But also how our devices sometimes act to contract our minds, like what you're saying. Like if you did not have your GPS guiding you to your friend's house, you would have learned the route yourself. So I think there's two ways to think about that. One is that we do want to be aware of when our sort of native abilities are atrophying, because we're offloading them too often to our devices. And there's an interesting body of research suggesting that that does happen. Our general sort of navigational skills, not just our awareness of specific landmarks, that does decline when we become too dependent on GPS. And there's a really interesting, I think the study was called something like Preventing Technology Dumb Down or something like that. And it was about actually making GPS a little more challenging to use, like requiring you to be more cognitively engaged and active, so that you have to pay it more attention and remember things. And there could be some advantages to making technology a little bit harder to use like that, so that we are more mentally engaged and we don't just allow ourselves to have the technology take over. But then I also want to make an argument for the idea that when we cognitively offload more mundane or routine tasks onto our technology, potentially that gives us an opportunity to spend that mental bandwidth on more elevated or higher level cognition. And it's the fact is that the brain actually isn't that great at, say, remembering information really precisely. That's why it's really great to have like a Google Calendar that will actually remind you of when it doesn't mess up and usually and remember, and misremember on what day some event is. Like, it's really good at keeping track of those things. And because it is, we can think our big imaginative thoughts, So I think it's a kind of it's something to be intentional and aware of. You don't want your native abilities to atrophy and to fade away because you're offloading all of that onto your devices. On the other hand, if you're making a conscious choice to offload those mundane tasks so that you can have your bigger thoughts, I wonder, maybe on that drive to your friend's house, you're daydreaming, or you're like thinking about what's happening next week. Like maybe you're using that time really well, and maybe it doesn't really matter that you don't know which street, and which turn to make or whatever.
Right. No, I think that makes sense. And there's one other part of this anecdote that I wanted to ask you about, actually, because on my way there, I always pass by my old high school. And the first couple times that I went, it was always like, oh, hey, there it is, where I played all those baseball games and those tennis matches and took all those math tests. And, every time I would drive by, I would have, some of these memories come flooding back, but the more that I've done it, it's the strangest thing. Like now, it doesn't even like register that's my high school. I'm just on my way to my friend's house, and that's it. Like I'm listening to a podcast, or I'm daydreaming, but it just like, in my awareness of my immediate geography and my immediate surroundings, it's like my high school, where I spent 4 incredibly formative years of my life, it just like doesn't exist. It's just completely outside my awareness. And that feels odd to me, because it's such an important physical location in my life. And so I guess I just wanted to ask about that. Like, why is it that over time, certain geographical locations, they just feel like they almost disappear from your awareness, unless you go out of your way to notice them? Like, why does that happen?
Yeah, that's a really interesting experience you had. I mean, the experience you had early on, where you were saying you had this flood of memories and images and associations, like that speaks to just how important place memory is. And I talk about that in the book in terms of how that's the basis on which like the memory palace technique works, where you associate bits of abstract information with a familiar place. Maybe some people use their old school as that space that they walk through as they reconstruct their memory palace. And so I do think it's so interesting that we just automatically tag, our minds automatically tag places that we've been with all these associated memories, especially when they were very emotionally charged or meaningful memories. But then I think what happened in subsequent visits or trips past the school is that you got habituated to that. When our minds are so tuned to pay attention to what's novel, and over time, week after week, as you passed your school, it ceased to become novel, and that makes it ceased to be novel to you. And so that makes sense in an evolutionary sense. If we got really worked up every time we walked into our house or something, and you're like, it's my house again. You know what I mean? Like that would kind of be like, so, and that, that actually gets back to this question of distraction and why open offices are so distracting. It's because we're so drawn to novelty, and we never really are able to, we're not able to turn that off. And so in an office where new things are constantly happening, our attention is constantly drawn to what's new and what's different, and not to what's always there. So I think in your case, the school has become a fixture now in your experience, and it's no longer worthy of note. And so instead you're paying attention to some other source of novel information, like the podcast that's playing in your car.
Right. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. And that alleviates like a strange sense of guilt I had about it. I'm like, shouldn't I be appreciating this more? Like, this is so cool that it's right there.
Well, if you move away and you don't see your school for a while, I bet that phenomenon will be refreshed to the next time.
It'll be renewed. Yes, very much so. Yeah. Right. So we have a few live viewers who have been commenting on our discussion as we've been going. For example, Stacy Morris commenting on our discussion about belonging in the workplace. She says there should be a portable workplace solution that can instantly transform any space into something more personal. I think that would be awesome.
I love that. I think we need that. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And then Gail Ritchie says, thank you for your plug for Montessori schooling. I'm a huge proponent of hands-on and minds-on learning. That sounds great. And oh, this is good too. James Gimian. Sorry, James, I'm probably not getting that right. But he just wrote in saying, do you find many people who are so attached to a brain-centric view that they think the extended mind is magical, woo-woo type thinking?
Yes, I do. And in fact, I don't think the image on the cover helps things, because it is a little bit like,
It is a
"Ooh,"
little,
and
yeah.
yeah.
It is eye-catching though. I
It
mean, I think it's
is.
a
It's
great
very pretty.
cover.
It's
Yeah.
very pretty, and I'm glad that they didn't slap like a picture of a brain up there, something very literal. So,
Right,
or like an
right.
exploding brain. But I do get lots of questions interestingly, about drug use, which is
Oh,
sort of
yeah.
interesting, because
Extend your mind,
I
Annie.
can definitely
Extend
see
your mind.
drugs as a mind extension, but I don't have any expertise there scientific expertise to
None that
share
you're
there.
willing to
So.
admit to, right?
Right, right. And I also get questions about, do you mean ESP or some kind of like,
Mm,
phenomenon that is not explained by science. And so I tried to be very clear that this is a work of science journalism, and the only thing that's woo-woo about it is that it does challenge a very deeply rooted convention in our culture. And to speak to James's question, yes, there's lots of people who are still very enmeshed in this kind of brain-bound conception of how thinking happens. And unfortunately, I think that brain-bound notion is baked into a lot of the practices that
yes.
we still enact in schools. The way we test students, for example, the way we assess their learning, the way we treat learning as if it's so individual instead of a collective enterprise.
Mhm.
And then in our workplaces too, this very individualistic idea of learning and thinking happening in one head, and not and in the head, and not not in the body, and not in spaces, and not connected to other people. It's so pervasive, actually. I mean, it's not something that we talk about. It's just like a taken for granted kind of aspect of the way we approach the world. So
Mhm.
although once I explain the idea of the extended mind, lots of people are open to it, our default is kind of a very brain bound perspective.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I hear that. And what I think is cool about your book, though, is that it's completely grounded in science, but even so much of it really sounds miraculous. Sort of like what we were talking about last time. I wanted to bring things back to embodied cognition just for a second, because I wanted to talk a little bit more about how the body alerts us to some sort of like unconscious pattern or unconscious piece of information. And like I remember in your book, you mentioned that that sometimes the body it rings like a bell, is I think maybe how you put it, where with like a sigh or something like that, the body alerts us to something like this. And that made me think about how maybe this is oversharing, but during an early therapy session that I had a couple years back, I remember in the middle of one of our sessions, my therapist says, when you talk about X thing, you tend to yawn a lot. Do you notice that? I'm like, really? And she's like, yeah, like whenever you bring this up, you yawn. And I'm like, that's so funny. And so that made me wonder, like, is that like my body trying to alert me to some sort of like unconscious information that I should be aware of? Like, tell us more about how that process of alerting us happens.
Yeah. Well, that's very observant by your therapist. I think she or he sounds like they're really on their game. But and what I immediately thought of, and it goes along with what I always say about how we're much more like animals than we are like machines, is that dogs yawn when they're stressed or anxious.
Oh,
So
really? Oh my God. I've always
so
said a dog is my spirit animal. This is amazing. This is perfect.
so I would really wonder if yawning was a kind of expression, your body's expression of anxiety, or I think in any case, no matter what you end up believing that means or figuring out that means, it is a signal. It is your body having it say, and I remember the line that you were referencing in the book, that I was saying that the body's rung like a bell to bring our attention to something that our conscious minds may not have been attending to. And that is the whole idea behind interoceptive attunement, this idea of becoming more sensitive and more aware of your internal sensations, because they do carry this wealth of knowledge and wisdom that otherwise is not accessible to us unless we're paying attention, So, what I love about that story, Jeremy, is that other people can help us pay attention, to our bodies, because we're not always tuned in. Mm-hmm. And so, I've often had the experience of someone saying, like, you look tired, or, you seem stressed, and you don't even realize it, but your body is kind of communicating not only to yourself, if you're listening, but also to other people in ways that, again, we may not be consciously aware of. And so the more we can be attuned to those internal signals and maybe external expressions of behavior, like yawning, I think the more we can make use of the body's knowledge and wisdom.
Right. So what are some of these other signals that we might want to be on the lookout for? Like we've got yawning, maybe sighing. I don't know. Like, are there specific things that we could recognize, or is it just too individual?
Well, what's interesting is that there's this flow of internal sensations all the time. We're often not attuned to them, as I was saying. And I interviewed Antonio Damasio, who is a researcher that I quote in the book as well. But I interviewed him recently for a piece I'm working on. And I was saying, why do you think it is that, we so often aren't attuned to our internal sensations? And he said, we're built to pay so much attention to the external world. We have so many vivid images and sounds and feelings coming in from the outside world, and again, that are novel, and they're always changing. Whereas our internal sensations are much more subtle, and they're always there. Our heart's always beating, and our stomach is always, doing its job, and our internal organs are always doing their jobs. And so we almost get habituated to them. We almost, just the way you got habituated to seeing your high school, because they're always with us, we don't pay as much attention to them. And that's what the point is of an exercise like the body scan. It's kind of bringing that attention back, almost making those internal sensations seem new and remarkable again, and you were asking Jeremy about, like, what are those internal sensations? And I guess I wanted to capture the fact that there's just this flow of sensations that are available all the time. I mean, I'm to name a few, they might be like our heart beating, and people have different levels of being aware of being able to be aware of their heart beating, but like the butterflies that you might feel in your stomach, or the internal sort of stress or tension of the way you hold your body. And I think the more you do bring that open-minded, non-judgmental, accepting awareness to your bodily sensations, the more like amazing variety and there's a real richness there that you almost can't believe was there, and that you weren't, we can go entire days without ever really tuning in. But when we do, it's like, oh my God, this was here all the time.
Right. No, that's so true. I mean, that's something that my therapist has also pointed out to me, where if I'm talking about feeling kind of stressed or anxious, she's like, well, where is that stress in your body? And, before she started asking me questions like that, I had never really thought about it. But when she did, I was like, well, now that you mention it, like, yeah, like I'm feeling like, like a knot in my stomach, and like my chest feels kind of tight. And yeah, by like drawing my awareness to those things, I do feel like I was better able to resolve some of those feelings of stress and anxiety. So yeah, that really resonates. And I think there's definitely something to that. And again, what I think is interesting is that, like, when I first encountered some of those questions, she's like, well, where is that stress? Like, to me, I would have categorized that as woo thinking, right? Where I'm like, this is like maybe some kind of like weird metaphor, but it's like, no, like there's like real like science.
Quite literal.
Yeah. Like this, like really, like it really helps to think of it in this way and to recognize the signals that our bodies are telling us, right? I mean, this is like real science.
Yes. And also to recognize that so much of our emotional and mental life doesn't just happen up here. I mean, one answer to where is this stress might be like, oh, it's in my head, you know, and actually, but really, and I think it's a very interesting direction that research in mental illness is going, that I see more and more attention being paid to the role of interoception in various mental illnesses like anxiety, panic disorder, depression, addiction, eating disorders. So many mental illnesses and conditions involves interoception being disrupted in some way. And so that it's a really exciting new avenue for treating these conditions also, is to try to cultivate that interoceptive awareness, or in some cases, I'm thinking of panic disorder, you actually want to work with that interoception, because people who have panic disorder are often oversensitive to their internal cues. They start to kind of, you know, feel like as the panic starts, they kind of become oversensitive to what they're feeling. And so the treatment of panic disorder becomes a matter of relearning or reframing those internal sensations in a different way. But I just think it's, you know, for so long we've treated mental illness as like a chemical imbalance in the brain, and that's such a limited understanding of what mental illness is. Just like the other forms of brain-bound bias, it kind of doesn't embrace the fullness of who we are, which has to include, you know, our bodies and our internal sensations.
Gotcha. Yeah, I love that. To move on to another question posed by a member, John Karras says, do you find work by geographers helpful to your research? And if so, what and who? And as maybe a follow-up to this, because I was thinking about this question when you submitted it, John, thank you for doing so. Like, I can totally see how, like, if how looking at a map, for example, like if you locate yourself in the middle of like a huge if you're landlocked, for example, if you're located in a landlocked area, I don't know, like maybe that would correlate with feelings of, I don't know, like, you know, or a lack of freedom because you're kind of like trapped in there. Like, I don't know. This is just pure conjecture. I have no idea if there's anything to it, but I think it's an interesting question. Like, does geography writ large, like on a macro scale, does that affect our state of mind at all?
Yeah, I just did a quick Google search there because I was wondering if a researcher that I quote in the book is a geographer. I wanted to give your questioner an actual name, and he is. I talk in the book. There's a chapter obviously on thinking with natural spaces, and in the section about like Central Park and why everyone who visits Central Park loves it, and I talk about the sort of the kind of nature that human beings seem to be drawn to. And there's this really lovely idea that we're drawn to a situation of prospect and refuge. And that the idea there is that we like to have an enclosed space where we feel safe, but where we can also see long distances. So we love to be like on a hilltop with trees all around, but we can see the vista. That would be like an ideal setting, and like a picture postcard kind of vista. And that idea of prospect and refuge was proposed by a geographer named J. Appleton. And I think he may be the only geographer that I cite in the book, but more generally, I think it's so important to remember, and I think probably geographers, would be the first to agree with this, that place is such an important determinant of how we think and how we feel. And yet, when we apply the very common metaphor of brain as computer to ourselves, then, a computer works the same no matter where it's located, whether it's in front of a gorgeous view or facing like a brick wall, but human beings aren't like that. And once we understand that, we are so exquisitely sensitive to context, and context does so much to shape the way we think and the way we feel, then consciously shaping and arranging and choosing the places where we do our thinking becomes much more important, and not something to be scoffed at or dismissed, like, oh, I need to be by a window to do my best work. Well, maybe you do. I see you have a beautiful window there right behind you, Jeremy. But those things actually matter, whether we have natural light, whether we have a view of nature, whether we, as we were saying before, whether we feel surrounded by cues that support us and our thinking. So, but place has so often been dismissed and not recognized for the incredibly important role that it plays.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's great that we're finally getting a better understanding of this, and hopefully more people can use that to their benefit. Also when it comes to doing our best work, there was a section of your book that made me laugh a little bit, because my dad is such a huge fan of multiple computer screens. He is always trying to convince me. He's like, "Are you sure you don't need another screen for?" I'm like, "Dad, I already have I already have the big one and my laptop. Like, I'm fine." But he's got like this whole setup. I wish you could see it. We're we're talking like 3 different screens, right? And
He's
and
onto something. You should take him up on that offer.
I know. I'm starting to think he was right all along. So yeah, I just wanted to ask about that in particular, especially as most of us are still doing a lot of work from home, and we do have a little bit of freedom to arrange those spaces any way we want to. Why is it that multiple screens might be the way to go?
Yeah, so this is super interesting research that that found that really big screens actually lead people to think better, to be able to carry out mental operations faster and more effectively and more accurately. And the reason behind that is that when we are interacting with a really big screen or multiple screens, like the setup your dad has, we can bring in all these embodied resources that otherwise get wasted when we're just looking at a tiny little screen. Like we can use our spatial memory, for example. Things can be, instead of having all these windows that you have to sort of manually manipulate, you can remember where things are, and you can navigate in a physical sense through like a landscape of ideas and information, instead of having to do it all in your head. And our brains really evolved to navigate through 3-dimensional landscapes. So it's something we do really effortlessly. It doesn't impose a lot of cognitive load. Whereas when we have a small screen and we have to constantly be moving things around and manipulating windows, that's a drain on our cognitive resources. Whereas when we can spread it all out and have it spatially arranged in a stable way, it saves us so much mental work, so I think your dad may have found his own way to this solution, because maybe he found that he was working more effectively when he had the 3 screens. I would be interested to know how he arrived at that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it seems like a cool intersection of the digital and the analog almost, where because as you say, we evolved to physically navigate these different spaces. And so when you think of it from that perspective, it's kind of amazing that we use digital technologies as well as we do at all, because they're so often operating at a level of abstraction and metaphor that we certainly didn't evolve to handle. But then when you can actually take a rectangle and drag it from one screen over to the next screen, that starts to mimic the analog experience a little bit better. And what that makes me think of as well, which I always thought was kind of funny, was that typing on your phone, when you if you don't have vibrate turned on, as you press all the little buttons, it gives you those little sounds that make it sound like you're typing a real button, So it's almost like tricking your brain into making you believe you're having this analog experience, even when it's a purely digital one. So I mean, do you feel, do you see this research as a good way to reconcile the digital capabilities that we now have with our predisposition for analog experiences?
Yeah. Well, I think many designers of digital experiences know that we are analog creatures, really, and we respond to analog cues. And that's why, even though it's not in any way technically necessary to get that typing sound when we type on our phones, we get that cue because it's helpful to us as just the way that we're wired. And I think that designers of technology could do even more with that, do more with the fact that we have bodies, that we exist in physical space, that we're such fundamentally social creatures. And, I suggest in the book that our technology itself is often brain bound. It treats us like sort of brains in vats rather than embodied, embedded, socially, connected people. And technology could work for us a lot better if it itself were extended. In other words, like if it incorporated bodily movement, if it incorporated gesture a lot more, for example, like I offer the example of, these online digital foreign language learning platforms that that could be incorporating gesture, like even an avatar making a gesture when helping people learn foreign language vocabulary. But instead, they're often locked into this brain-bound mode of like just written or spoken language, when so easily we could incorporate the body into that kind of learning.
Right. What that makes me think of, Annie, is video games, because I remember when the Nintendo Wii came out, and you could actually hold a controller and pretend to really be bowling or playing tennis or whatever. This was, at the time, this was heralded as the future of gaming, right?
Right.
And to a certain extent, this has continued a little bit, like with the Oculus Rift, like this new VR technology that does allow you to play games with your body, where physical movement is incorporated into the experience. So that this does still exist, and it is still popular in a certain way. And yet the vast majority of gaming remains just kind of doing this, right? Why do you think that is? That feels counterintuitive to me, given all this research.
Yeah. That's a good question. I mean, why are we so attached to this brain-bound kind of conception? I think it's, for one thing, it has very deep roots in our culture, going all the way back to Rene Descartes and the idea that mind and body are separate. And we don't think of them as intimately entwined as they are. But that said, there is some really exciting research being done with simulations and virtual reality used as educational tools, and allowing students to act out being some kind of scientific entity, or, like, as you were saying, sort of manipulate things in a digital realm. And so my hope is that we can kind of combine the best of those two worlds, like the fact that we are so easily and effortlessly engaged by analog objects and materials, and with the possibilities of the virtual world where things can happen. You could blow up an atom and like see see all its parts, and something you could never do in real life. So I think there's such exciting possibilities, as long as the developers of technology remember that we're not just brains, but we have bodies, and we exist in space, and we are connected to other people.
Right. Yeah, I think that's very well said. And I think Melissa Painter chimed in on this. And she makes a great point. She says it's because they are designing us for the tech versus designing the tech for us.
Yeah, that's very well put. Yeah,
I think it is. Yes, absolutely. It's a good reminder. And Stacey Morris chimed back in as well. And she says memory palaces based in movement, like literally moving and gesturing through space, could be really powerful at learning new subjects. Did you have any thoughts on that?
Well, that's another. There are some virtual reality platforms that employ the memory palace technique, but in virtual reality, which I think is a really cool idea. And then one other potential application of virtual reality that I think is so cool is creating virtual classrooms for students that are imbued with those cues of belonging and identity that we were talking about, but in ways that might not be possible in real life. So, for example, a female student who's going to her class, her STEM class, like her science or math class, could see herself in virtual reality in a classroom that's filled with other female students, for example, like in a way that would not probably happen in real life. And so that could be, and it turns out research finds that looking at the composition of the group that we're in is itself a really important cue of belonging or not belonging. So I just think it's so cool, especially since we have not seen the end of remote or digital schooling, that we could now be designing literally like on digital spaces, digital classrooms, with all this, informed by all this knowledge that we have now about how important space is and things like cues of identity and belonging. We can so easily build those into digital spaces. I think it's a huge, exciting frontier.
Yeah. And as a follow-up question to that, I wonder if like, and maybe this is splitting hairs, but I think this is actually an interesting distinction. Like, would that apply only in a virtual reality context, or could it work in a different digital environment? And here's what I mean by that. Like if I want to be learning something in a class with my peers, say, in a digital environment, would that have to be like in a virtual reality, first person perspective, like I look around and I see other people? Or could it almost be like a much more traditional video game where you're using an avatar that you can see, which is surrounded by other similar avatars? Because I know that when I'm playing a game, I feel a very strong sense of identification with my avatar, right? Even if it's from a third person perspective.
Yeah.
And so I don't know, we might have to get a game designer in here, but I'm just wondering, like, do you think that those same belonging cues would have the same benefits, even if you were on the outside looking at a digital avatar of yourself?
Interesting. Well, what that makes me think of is another incredibly interesting strand of research, which looks at what happens when you're given an avatar who is different from you in some way, and yet it seems to move with you and in every way seems to be you. It turns out to be an incredibly powerful way of generating empathy for the person of that your avatar represents, because we are so self-centered, really. We love ourselves, and so it turns out to be a very fast acting kind of effect, that if you are acting as if and moving as if you're this person, you start to have warmer and more positive feelings towards them, even if they're in some outgroup that, you didn't identify with or even actively disliked before. And I just think, again, there's so much potential there in terms of changing attitudes and maybe like addressing biases and prejudices, because we know that a brain-bound way of addressing prejudice and bias doesn't work very well. It's really hard to change people's beliefs in that very intellectual way. But it turns out that if you have an embodied experience of being someone in a different group, that is a much more powerful way of changing your views and your beliefs. So I just think that's such a cool possibility to explore.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And Gail Ritchie here chimed in saying, a lot of us did that last year with our Bitmoji classrooms. I don't really know what that is, but that sounds very much like what we're talking about. So I'm gonna have to Google that later. Thank you, Gail. So Annie, we're just about out of time here. So just one last question for you. As we're about to move on, sadly, from The Extended Mind to How to Change, our next read.
Also a great book.
Yes, also a great book. And so, if you could just leave our membership with one final message, one final piece of advice or tip or thought about how to make the most of their extended minds, what might that be?
I think I'm going to have to go with the way I ended the book, honestly, which was encouraging people to see themselves and see others as creatures of the world, and not just brains in vats. And there's a lot of pressures in society for us to think of ourselves and others that way. And I want to encourage readers who made it to the end of the book to get there someday, but to see humans in the round, as we exist in the world, in bodies, embedded in places and connected to other people. And I just think it's such a much fuller and more accurate idea of who we are. And that's what I'd like to leave readers with.
I think that's perfect. So everybody, as you know, the book is The Extended Mind. Please do finish it. You're going to love it, I promise. But yeah, I mean, hopefully we can talk to you again soon, Annie. And if you have another book, definitely let us know because we'd love to feature
Someday.
it. But yeah, but thank you again, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
This has been fun. Thank you so much, Jeremy.